Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. My name is Anna and I'm a non-native teacher of English from Siberia, hence the name of the channel. So I have wanted to record this video for a really long time because I've been teaching English for 15 years. I started tutoring when I was 17, so more than 15 years actually. And the most frequent and common questions that I get from my students is how I have achieved the level of English I have now. So to begin with, I'm not really completely happy with my English as of now. I know I can do better and I need to enlarge my vocabulary because I think it's the problem of most of the teachers, especially if you teach different levels, and you have to sort of simplify your vocabulary from time to time, and it comes at the expense of your own progress. So I would love to enlarge my vocabulary, make it better and improve my pronunciation. And I'm saying this because when I was around 24, 25 years old, I would record my voice just to hear what my English sounded like from another perspective. And I would think to myself, oh my God, my English is just amazing. Like, can I possibly speak any better? And listening to the same recordings now, being 34 years of age, I have to admit to myself that this is not the English you can admire. So I think that if I decide to watch the same video 10 years later, I'll have a lot of questions to ask myself. Anyways, let's not digress to another subject. I am recording this video to tell you my story of learning English. In an environment where there are almost no native speakers around you and you live thousands and thousands of miles away from any English-speaking country. So to begin with, I'm very lucky to have been born in an academic family. My grandmother was a teacher of English. She passed away several years ago and it was a huge loss for me, because she has given me this golden ticket to life. I'm sure that without her, I wouldn't have achieved the level of English I have now, and I wouldn't have expressed so much interest to foreign languages and liberal arts. So my grandmother started teaching me English when I was about 5 or 6 years old, and it was in the middle of the 90s. I myself was born in the Soviet Union, but several years later it collapsed, and after it things were not going particularly well in the country. And teaching children English at such an early age was considered a novelty. Of course, we didn't have lessons in this typical sense, like open your books at page
394.
So my grandmother taught me nursery rhymes, we danced to English songs, she let me listen to some English fairy tales, and of course I didn't understand them, but now I think it was pretty useful for the accent and the pronunciation, just to get used to the sound of the language. But I was not a fan of the English language. I still remember my grandmother telling me that I would say to her something like, "Get off me with your English, like, don't teach me any English, I don't like it, just let me play with my friends and my toys." So I was a completely normal, mediocre child who had no interest in foreign languages. I didn't really like learning anything at this age. I just loved playing with my friends and, you know, with my toys and playing outside and pretty much doing nothing. But it was also in my childhood when I was introduced to the idea of what I need English for. So I was in my grandmother's apartment, and my mom often left me there with my grandma because she was working and building her career, and I was a little bit bored, and fortunately we didn't really have any gadgets back then. It was at the beginning of the 90s and we didn't have many cartoons, so I would just play with my toys. I particularly loved playing with buttons. Like, if you're from Russia, or maybe you have the same story from your childhood if you were born in the 80s or 90s, my grandmother had this box with buttons, lots of buttons of different sizes and colors, and I loved to play with them. Like, they would be my army, or they would be my friends, they would be my animals and just decorative elements. It was really amazing. So I had got really bored playing with the buttons, and I decided to take a look at some of my grandmother's course books. So I took a random course book, and on one of the pages I saw the picture of the royal family standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, I think. Maybe it was stripping the colour or something like that. And it was pretty unusual what I saw, because it was a palace and, you know, everyone was in a festive mood. So I came up to my father and I asked him who this woman was, because I was like 5 years old or 6 years old. And he told me, "Oh, this is the Queen of England." And I was like, come on, you don't have to lie to me, because I know there are no kings or queens anymore. They're just presidents, because we are living in the 20th century and all the princes and princesses and queens and kings are just in fairy tales. They don't exist anymore, just like dragons. And he told me, no, this is not true, because in England, there's actually a queen and there are princes and princesses and dukes and duchesses. So because this country is a monarchy and its queen still wears the crown, and there are palaces and castles, and to me it was like a fairy tale come true, because I was like this typical girl and I loved fairy tales, but I only loved bad characters. Like when I was watching Aladdin, I had a huge crush on Jafar, and when I was watching Hercules, I really loved Hades. So anyways, for me, it was like a fairy tale, but in real life. And then my father told me a little bit about the history of England, and I loved it so much, and I was just fascinated with the idea that there is still a country with the royal family in it. So when I read the news from Great Britain, or to be more precise, the opinions of some people who would like the monarchy to be abolished, I understand them. I can understand, the Republicans' concern, but as a foreigner, as an outsider, I think the royal family is a huge asset to your country, if you are watching me from Great Britain, and it's great for tourism. So I think the royal family attracts so many people from around the world, because on some subconscious level we are still fascinated by this fairy tale come true, by the kings and queens and princes and princesses. And I remember my father telling me, because we were lying on the sofa and sort of looking through the pictures of the book, I remember him telling me that someday we would go to Great Britain together and see the Queen. Well, alas, it was not to be. My dad passed away at the end of the 90's, and now the Queen also died last year, and I think it's a huge loss to so many citizens of Great Britain, because she was the embodiment of not just one historical epoch, of many eras throughout history. And in my opinion, she's like a capsule, like a time capsule that held inside her so many memories of different generations. Anyways, that was the moment when I got fascinated by the history of England, and this interest rekindled later when I was around 13 or 14 years old, and I'll tell you about that a bit later. So when I went to school, of course I learned English just like any other child in Russia, because English is the first foreign language at school. You have to learn it. It's compulsory, mandatory, and I'm really happy about this, because it's an international language and it opened so many doors, and you can read and learn so much if you can speak this language. But in spite of the fact that I went to the same school where my grandmother was teaching, it was her idea to send me there because it was one of the best language schools in my hometown in Eastern Siberia. So despite the fact that she was a teacher there, I wasn't a particularly diligent student. I understood English, and my grandmother was ready to explain anything to me when we were at home, but I can't say that I was in love with the subject. But the turning point of my journey across the kingdom of the English language happened when I was 13 years old. We had an American student come to our school in Eastern Siberia, and I was really excited to meet her, and my grandmother told me, you must come, you must ask her questions, or at least listen to her. And of course I had, lots of questions for this girl, like what life is like in America and so on. But I was too shy to do this during the class, and my grandmother did an amazing thing. So she told me to accompany this girl to the bus stop, and it was like a 10-minute walk from school. And she just talked to this girl, to this teenage student, and she told her, like, can my daughter accompany you? She can show you to the bus stop. And I said, yeah, okay, I will just, I was very timid at that moment, and but I said yes. And now I understand that it was one of the best decisions that my grandmother had ever made. And while I was walking to the bus stop with this girl, there was only one thing that I wished for. I just wished the bus stop had been farther away from my school, because there were so many questions I wanted to ask this lady. And the most amazing thing of it all was that I could understand her and she could understand me. And that was the first perfect, explicit, vivid example that if you know English, you can talk to people who speak this language, and you can understand them and they can understand you, and you can learn so much, so many things that other people who don't speak this language cannot learn. And when you see with your own eyes, when you experience this practical implication of your knowledge, this changes your attitude to learning a foreign language, no matter what language we are speaking about. So it was an amazing promenade. And then I also realized that this student was going the same way as me, so she lived in practically the same neighborhood, and we took a minibus, like a shuttle bus. This is a form of public transport in Russia, like small buses that take you from one place to another. And the most interesting thing is that you have to scream out the name of the bus stop where you want the bus to stop, because sometimes there are too many people inside it and the driver just, goes past the bus stop and never stops there unless you scream out the name of this particular bus stop. So I was 100% engaged in the conversation with my new American friend, and we were talking for 20 minutes, and eventually I had to sort of scream out the name of my bus stop, in Russian of course. And I remember when I shifted from English into Russian and when I said the name of the bus stop, the old lady who was sitting in front of me, she looked at me like, and I felt so proud of myself. I think I'm naturally a show-off, otherwise I wouldn't have recorded this video. And not only did I feel that I was understood by a person from another country, I also experienced this avalanche of pride. I felt like the time I had invested in learning English had finally paid off. Because before that, for me, English had been just a subject at school that I had to learn, I had to study, I had to do my homework and learn all the irregular verbs and sometimes talk during the class, but I couldn't really understand what I would do with this knowledge. And when I finally met that girl, it's a pity I can't remember her name, I realized what I had been doing this for. That's why it's so important to give your students a chance to implement their knowledge in practice. But most of the schools around the world can't give their students this opportunity. And it was after this revelation that I started asking my grandmother to give me more English tests, although I had already done them before, a lot less willingly though, because I couldn't see the goal of my effort clearly. And it's also worth mentioning that my grandmother was a very strict teacher, to say the least. She was very demanding to her students and particularly to me, and that was when I realized that this is not the type of teacher I want to be when I grow up, although I didn't really dream of becoming one when I was a teenager. And with all due respect to my grandmother, she could even make her students cry during her lessons, and I myself felt offended and outraged sometimes. Although, as you can see, it all paid off. Would I have achieved the level of English that I have now if my grandmother hadn't been so demanding? Well, I can't say for sure. Still, I'm really grateful to my grandmother for all her hard work, and I wish I had thanked her more often when she was alive. The next thing that made me fall in love with the English language even more was a magazine called Speak Out. It was published in Moscow in the early 2000s and helped students learn English. There were plenty of engaging articles there that were tailored to intermediate and upper intermediate level students, and I read them with so much enthusiasm. Moreover, under each article there was a box with new vocabulary, which made the reading process significantly easier. So basically you didn't have to interrupt yourself every time you came across an unknown word, because most of them had already been translated for you. And that was back in 2002, 2003, when we couldn't even dream of online dictionaries and you had to look up every unknown word in a paper dictionary. And I still remember some of the articles. One of them was about the boarding school Prince William and Prince Harry went to, and it was really interesting to have like a little sneak peek into the life of the students of that school. And I also remember some horror stories for children that I loved reading, just to tickle my nerves. And there was also some celebrity gossip, which was really relevant, I think, for a teenage girl. And this is the reason why I always try to find interesting and relatable materials for my students, having asked them previously about their interests and hobbies on our first lesson. My next big or even huge step to improving my English was VHS tapes, or tape cassettes. If you were born in the 80s or 90s, you must remember them. And trust me, it was a huge challenge to find a VHS tape in English in Siberia in the early 2000s. But again, my grandmother came to rescue and she provided me with this, well, literally treasure. Back then, in my hometown, on the first floor of the University of Languages, there was a little kiosk where they sold VHS tapes in English. I can't say the choice was very impressive, but my grandmother went there quite often to be the first one to buy the videotapes that I would be interested in. And my very first tape cassette in English was Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. I was so happy when my grandmother gave it to me, because back then, when I was around 12 or 13, I had a huge crush on Professor Snape.
Obvious.
And I was so ashamed, nearly mortified, to tell my friends the truth because, you know, like, Professor Snape was pretty old for me back then, and he still is. I made them believe, I did my best to make them believe that I was into Harry Potter, Daniel Radcliffe. And I think at a certain point, trying to conceal my infatuation, I crossed the line and it became evident that I was pretending to have a crush on Harry Potter. Because I was like, oh my god, this is not the boy who lived. This is the most handsome boy who lived. Oh my god, I can't stop looking at Harry Potter. Did I tell you I have 75 posters of Daniel Radcliffe in my room? And at a certain point, my friend told me, you don't have a crush on Harry Potter because I didn't see any posters of him in your room and I was there yesterday. And I only confessed about my preferences to my best friend because she had a crush on Dracula, I think, so we were pretty close. And then my grandmother bought me more VHS tapes. It was The Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, Lion King, What a Girl Wants, and oh, one of the best VHS tapes she bought me was a 4-hour documentary on Elizabeth I Tudor. And again, my grandmother was perfectly aware that I was crazy about Elizabeth I. We had quite a profound course of foreign history in my school, and one day our history teacher told us about Elizabeth I, and I was fascinated by that woman. It was just unbelievable that a woman who's just the second queen on the English throne can rule for more than 40 years, and the whole era would later be called the Golden Age or Elizabethan era, and I was really amazed. Although technically you could say that Elizabeth was the third queen on the English throne if you include Lady Jane Grey in this list. And that was the moment when I got carried away with the history of England, and I was so fascinated by the reign of Elizabeth I that I even wrote a history paper consisting of 13-14 pages, and I brought it to my history teacher as a surprise. Now being a teacher myself, I don't think she was particularly happy to read all these 14 pages. And also, when my grandmother saw that I was expressing quite a lot of interest to the reign of Elizabeth I, she bought me a book on the history of the Tudor dynasty. And I loved it so much, and I started reading it when I was 13, 14, and there were so many unknown words in the book. At first, it was pretty demotivating because I had to stop reading every 2 seconds because every 4th or 5th word was unknown, but still I enlarged my vocabulary quite a lot thanks to that book. That's why I will never stop telling my colleagues just how important it is to at least try to create this bridge between the language you are teaching and the interests of your students, because it's a lot more enjoyable, engaging, and just generally interesting to study a foreign language when it is related to your interests. And then when I graduated from school, YouTube appeared. And I'm a huge fan of YouTube because it helped me learn English, French and Spanish, or at least perfect these languages. And I think if I had had YouTube when I was a school student, I would have learned all of these languages so much faster. As for my accent, what really helped me was definitely Harry Potter, all the films, because they're in British English. And then the next thing that helped me perfect the accent was Downton Abbey.
I'm so looking forward to seeing your mother again. When I'm with her, I'm reminded of the virtues of the English.
But isn't she American?
Exactly.
Being an ardent admirer of Maggie Smith, I have watched all the seasons of Downton Abbey. I remember I was watching one of the seasons, one of the episodes, when I was heavily pregnant and I had to go to hospital to give birth to my second child, to my daughter. And I couldn't stop watching the episode because it was so exciting, and eventually my doctor, my gynecologist, called me and she was like, "Where are you?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, Of course I couldn't tell her I was watching Downton Abbey. I had to lie that I was packing my bag. And I think that even if you don't have a particular talent for imitating accents, you will still speak with the British accent after you have watched several seasons of Downton Abbey. So this is my story of learning English, and it's still continuing, of course, because it's impossible to just say, I have learned English. It will go on for the rest of my life because the language is always changing, it is transformed by the people who speak it. But anyways, I hope that my pieces of advice will help you learn English. And if you're a native speaker watching this video, I'll be extremely grateful if you leave some feedback on what I should improve about my English, about my pronunciation, vocabulary, grammar, because I'm sure I've made some mistakes in this video. It'll also be really great if you like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, feel free to leave questions in the comment section if you have any. See you in my next video. Bye!